I'm a cybersecurity professional. I've been now doing this for the better part of about 20 years. I started way back, dabbling in this in 2003 when HIPAA started to become a real thing. Um, and I've recently joined Online Business Systems as part of what is we currently call the RSP, the Risk, Security, and Privacy practice, but we're going through a rebrand. We're going to be OBS Cyber, so we're gonna be cool like all the other kids.
That sounds
Um,
slick.
yeah. So this, pretty basic, layout here that I want to go over. Just kind of set the stage and kind of describe these things, and especially since we have kind of a smaller group. I'm really looking forward to Q&A, and also if there's even security questions, cloud or otherwise, afterwards, I don't be shy. I love doing this stuff. But yeah, once kind of set the stage and then kind of look at what does the journey look like from an organization as they go from those initial startup phases to getting those later rounds of funding and maybe even an exit, and what role does and should security play kind of at each stop along that journey. So I'm just gonna kind of jump into this. It's the security dilemma is really like damned if you do and damned if you don't. And there's a lot of give and take and a lot of kind of conflicting interest between these things. We want, especially when we're in a startup situation, we want to move fast. We want to break things. We want to disrupt. We want, we're innovating. But we also want to be secure, and we want to be safe, and we want to protect our IP and our confidential information and our customers' confidential information. And these things don't always necessarily, want to have those vectors don't necessarily want to have the same directions all the time. So first I want to talk about kind of the cost of neglecting security. There's a lot, and this is usually where folks tend to err, by doing too little and then it biting them later. Something that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of is technical debt. There's a lot of technical debt that can accrue due to cybersecurity or the lack thereof. And you probably don't notice it in the first kind of stage or two of a company's life cycle, but as it starts to put on its big kid pants and beyond, it definitely can come and rear its head. There and often where that comes in is understanding how cybersecurity isn't just protecting things, but how it is actually enabling growth. And that comes often in the form of assurances. So especially if you're going to start, doing business with enterprise customers, pretty much all of them want, air quotes, reasonable assurances, and they can take many different forms. And I have a feeling, more than a few of you have filled out your at least one too many cybersecurity questionnaires. They're awful, but that's just one example. Other forms of assurance are things like a SOC 2 audit report, ISO 27001 certification. If you're playing in certain regulated industries, you're going to have things like the high trust, PCI. If you're in the defense sector, there's this fun thing called CMMC that's out there now. Lots of fun acronyms and alphabet soup. The other place, and this is one I feel very passionate about, and I see this all the time, and surprisingly in large organizations as well, is risk management. And that's kind of, I think that's what really can separate a good cyber professional or cybersecurity leader from the rest of the pack, is knowing when to, get out of their lane, get out of their lane and hand over the business decisions, the risk management decisions to the business leaders. There's a lot of my peers that need to be this, kind of need to be the smartest person in the room, and be the big shot and make the decisions, and that's, I personally think that's folly, and it doesn't set the stage for good risk management. The other thing that I see, and I've been seeing this for years, is ignoring risk, and this is a part of risk management, and specifically risk treatment. I won't go too deep into it, at least right now, but there are 4 main types of risk treatment. So when you have a risk, let's say phishing, we'll pick an easy one, and we'll say it's ranked up, it's high, but doesn't really matter. The next step is, how are we going to treat that risk, right? Okay, are we going to apply additional controls and mitigate it? Are we going to outsource, something to a third party and transfer that risk? Is the risk low enough for us that we're willing to accept it? Those are the 3 general forms of risk treatment that are okay. The 4th is to ignore it. And that's when people get into trouble. That's really when companies and executives get their face in the paper for the wrong reasons. So, I talked about phishing, and I think that's a good one to because that is, if phishing isn't a threat that you are worried about, it should be. And the reason goes back to, one, the potential impact is very high. That's kind of the worst case scenario. And then the likelihood of a phishing event happening is also very high. There's different flavors, but it's happening almost constantly. And
Sean, can I speak to that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
With phishing, I think it's wild because, I get texts and emails of what's clearly phishing to me.
Yeah.
But then I hear of cases where colleagues and coworkers have fallen for the phishing, where just because it may seem obvious to me doesn't mean it's going to seem obvious to somebody else. And that social engineering is all over the place. And to I think, to your point, just putting your head in the sand is not the way to go on that.
Yeah. And really, not just putting your head in the sand and ignoring it seems like, kind of a gross oversimplification, but there are other, there's nuance to ignoring that risk. I mean, I like to pick on that one because year in and year out, it is the number one initial threat vectors for all security breaches. So, if you were to be a nerd like me and go and read about these things, in various publications, more often than not, whatever eventually happened, be it ransomware or data exfiltration or corporate exfiltration, that's beside the point. The initial first entry of that incident is usually phishing. It's like Greg said, it's really, a lot of it is a numbers game. It may seem obvious to you or to me or whomever, but they don't care. The attackers don't care. They're going for that fraction of a percent. They just need that one person to, be trusting enough to click the link, put in their, give away their credentials to a spoofing site, etc. So, yeah. So that, I mean, that's one example. Um, the next is kind of the number two example I see as like another, big threat is going to be vendors and third parties. And I see a lot of organizations, again, from small all the way up to enterprise, who don't do good security due diligence, and it bites them. Um, they either do sometimes they do too much, but often it's they do too little. Um, for instance, I talked about assurances like a SOC 2 or an ISO cert. Um, you actually have to make sure that those things are real. I've over the years, I have come across, and the people that have worked with me have come across fraudulent ISO 27001 certs and fraudulent SOC 2 reports. So people are spoofing those. Also, this is very frequent. This is getting into a little bit of the details, but a lot of organizations will treat a SOC 2 report as a certification. It's kind of the dialogue is something along with, hey, we want you to have a SOC 2. It's like, okay, here you go. I'll send it over, blah, blah, blah. Oh, thanks. And then they don't look at it. They don't read it. They're just like, oh, they had a SOC 2, good. A SOC 2 is really a story, and it needs to be read and reviewed. And yeah, it's an auto report, and that sounds like, one of the least fun things ever. But once you actually kind of know how those things are broken down, it's actually a quick process.
What would
But
you say
again,
you'd look for in those reports? Because I, funny enough, I've been that person that just glosses over
okay,
and probably should have read it.
okay,
Is there like a really important section?
there are three things to look for. And I'll kind of speed run these. So the SOC 2 report is broken up into basically three main sections. So the first third, that's the auditing firms, that's mostly where that they control. You don't need to read the whole thing. Most of it is standard language. What you need to find is the auditor's opinion or determination. And it's like a part of a paragraph. It's you're really looking for really three things, because you should be getting a SOC 2 type 2, not a type 1. So you're going to be looking for oh no, I gotta put me on the spot. Going the Wayback Machine. Do the control okay, it's do the controls reasonably reflect the in-scope criteria? So there's trust service criteria. So there's kind of a we'll call them guidelines that they have to more or less follow. Do the controls more or less match up with the guidelines, the criteria? The next one is the system description essentially sound? Is it reasonable? Does it make, um, and and I'll get to what the system description is. And then the third thing you're looking for, and again, these are just like one sentence each, is did the controls operate as intended during the testing window? So usually you've got like an annual testing window. And you really just want to look for that little section and make sure all three are in the positive. It takes less than a minute for that. It takes me a lot longer to describe it. The next third is the system description. This is the thing that you do have to read, and you have to read with fine detail. But it really, it's talking about what is the service and what is the system, and a bit of like kind of describing what the organization is. It's luckily there's a standard format the AICPA puts out. It's a lot of plug and play for those companies being audited. So there's a similar flow to how to where different aspects are. But I found things in there like, oh, we don't have any backups. So it's one of those, that's the part you do have to read, and kind of just, you're looking for red flags, like no backups or no risk assessments or strange subservice organizations. Those are critical third. That's CPA talk for a critical third party vendor. And then the last section is where they have a matrix of the organization's controls and the auditor's tests of each controls and whether or not, and again, a determination of whether or not that each control operated as intended during their testing window. And you can just skim through that really quick because what you're looking for is what are usually called exceptions. You don't need to go and read all the controls because again, the auditor is already saying they did that and those controls align with the criteria just fine. You just need to look for exceptions. So a classic example would be, hey, there's a control that says we're going to disable access within 24 hours of employee termination. And so the auditors are going to test that. They're going to take a sample population from all of the last year's terminations. And they're going to see if there's any, if they follow that rule every single time. And if they didn't, that'll trigger an exception. That's what you're going to look for. And not all exceptions are created equal. Like that one, that's a common one I mentioned. It's kind of ticky-tacky. And then you kind of, at the bottom of that whole section, you'll see management's response to the exceptions. And usually it's something along the lines, yes, we saw this, and here's, there's some circumstances around it, and then we went back and we mitigated, we this, and this. But that's the whole process. So skim the first third, look for the auditor's determinations. The middle third, the system description, definitely read that in detail, looking for red flags, and then skim the last third, look for exceptions. That's it. And all in all, 15 minutes to reasonably review a SOC 2 report, I would say. I mean, I've done a lot of these. Maybe the first few might take someone uninitiated a little bit longer, maybe half an hour, but once you see that they're very similar, you can skip to all the salient points. So great little segue there, Greg. See, where did I leave off?
It was super helpful, by the way.
Oh yeah, no, I see again, most of these like, oh, it's a SOC 2, and what am I supposed to do with this? Or great, you have one, check the box, right? But no, this is what you look for. This is the kind of stuff to be cognizant of. Yeah, and then and you want to be able to respond to those, on the flip side. So you want on one side, you want to be doing proper due diligence, obtaining proper assurances from your vendors, but likewise, you need to play the other side of the coin and be responsive and thorough and provide reasonable assurances to your customers. So it's good to know both sides of how those things flip-flop. And then, so this is kind of the funny one. Well, maybe not. But there are pitfalls to over securing. You can certainly go too far. And the general rule of thumb is, say you've identified a risk of some sort. If your mitigation is going to cost more than the risk would if it were to fully actualize, don't do that. Don't, because then you're just throwing money on the burn pile. I think this is best kind of articulate. There's a story, I won't name names. This is a past client. Actually, they don't exist anymore, but I'll get to why. But they called me up and they needed help with completing a SOC 2. So start doing all the things. We jump into the work and I'm reviewing all of their documentation, and I come across these PCI certs. They're ROCs, they're reports on compliance, and that's several. And this was a fairly early stage startup, and I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So I go back to my POC there. I'm like, well, okay, so reviewing things, I came across these PCI reports, these ROCs. And he's like, yeah, anything look wrong? He's like, no, nothing's wrong with them. But why do you have them? To which he replied, well, all the company co-founders are ex-Visa executives, and they really wanted us to be PCI compliant. Okay, I get that. So why do you have them? Because they spent a lot of money to get these certs, and they actually were not handling, if I remember correctly, payment card information.
That's
So they,
crazy.
oh yeah, it seemed absolutely bonkers to me. So they spent all this money to get these PCI certs for nothing, and they did get some policies and risk assessment. They got some stuff out of it, but that they're still paying for the QSA's audit.
Can I ask a question on that? And so
Yeah,
maybe this is what they were thinking, and maybe those in the crowd are thinking the same. If you are accepting money from customers, that doesn't count as handling transactions, right? PCI means like you're like saving credit card information, not just having people pay
yeah,
your invoices, right?
right. No, yeah. You send out an invoice or payment, and you get not most of the times you'll get an ACH. Maybe you do accept credit cards, but you're going to be using like a merchant services. They're the PCI processor. You're not actually going to hopefully take that credit card information, let alone store it on your systems. Because that's just opening up the whole PCI can of worms. Plus, if you are using taking credit card payments, ideally for your company, you'd use something like Plaid or Stripe. Like they've don't don't reinvent the wheel. Just like don't roll your own AI. Don't reinvent this wheel. Like Plaid and Stripe are out there, and they're the companies they are for a reason. And that's a great example of transferring risk. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, these were smart people. I'm not saying they were dumb, but former Visa executives, but they know their stuff, but they just overinvested in security and assurance way too early. And like I alluded to earlier, that after a year, like we got them their SOC 2, and and they were able to close the deal with that, like the client or clients that was requiring it. But a year later, that company didn't exist anymore. Okay, so I've kind of danced around this a little bit. I want to talk about right sizing security. So again, so managing and defining risks, selecting controls, and then assessing risk and controls. And these are things that flow together, but they're different. I really, the first thing that, and again, I see this all the time. People don't do this. But when we talk about risk, and this really is probably a broader topic than security, but that's just my sphere of influence, is to first define your risk tolerance. And that's and we're talking this, so this is like the first real step of risk management. And I like to think of like defining what is your ouch point. Now, and there's a lot of ways to go about this, and and you can do, because there's a lot of styles of measuring and assessing risk. There's quantitative, where you basically are using dollar amounts. There's semi-quantitative, where you kind of apply arbitrary numbers to risk, like a 1 through 5 or a 1 through 10. And then there's qualitative, which is the kind of the high, medium, low, or very high through very low. But whatever methodology you go with, one of the first things you want to decide is, what's that ouch point? So if your risk tolerance is say moderate. And again, and this is a very personal and individual thing to each company. So just because company A is at a high risk tolerance doesn't mean company B should not be at a low risk tolerance or vice versa. It's very individualized. But define where that ouch point is. And everything else now has context and a framework, because otherwise, the kind of the next real step around this is we're going to assess risk. But if we haven't said what's our ouch point, what is our risk tolerance, if we come back with a moderate or a high risk or a 10 out of 20 or whatever, doesn't matter, then what does that even mean to the organization? That's the rub. The next thing is to select controls. And luckily, again, this is another thing where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are control frameworks out there. They are, some of them, a lot of them are in the public domain. And, some of them are, easier to read and understand than others, but they're out there, they exist. And the ones that aren't in the public domain necessarily, the paywall is minimal. And you want to select preferably something that's holistic, but also fits with your long-term strategic plan. And I have two preferred frameworks that I like to use when helping clients. And the tipping point between them is really, where is your market, right? If you intend or you are going to be an international business, multinational business, then it's probably best to adopt the ISO 27001 controls. Just because that is what your customers are going to be asking about and caring about more. If you're predominantly US based, then you probably would be best off with the NIST controls. And I'm saying that kind of broadly and generally because there's different groupings. There's the cybersecurity framework, which is fine. It's not my preferred. There's also NIST Special Publication 800-53, otherwise known as the Risk Management Framework. That one's really good. It's got all sorts of stuff. But it sets, it's like what framework is really kind of dependent upon what kind of questions you might get asked. And once you kind of have those in place, now you got to start putting rubber to the road. So what I see a lot of times is people, including my peers, will conflate risk with compliance and risk with controls, and they really shouldn't. These are two different things, and the reason is the assessing risk and assessing your controls are asking two different questions. So I'm actually going to do the controls first, as far as the questions. This is you're asking yourself, are the similar to the SOC 2, are the controls that we have selected operating as we intend? Right? We're going, we've already decided we're going to do ABC XYZ. Well, are we doing ABC XYZ, and are we getting out of that what we want? A risk assessment is asking the question, are our controls enough? Is there something else that we should be considering?
So question, Sean, we've got a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
How do you feel about controls that have nothing to do with IT, like HR, performance reviews, or whatever else you can think of?
Okay, okay, that's actually a really great question. So, as I said at the very beginning, I've been doing this for about better part of 20 years or more. So I was here for the dark days when cybersecurity was kind of the redheaded stepchild that was always put in the corner of the corporate world. Within the last 5+ years, now, I kind of like to say, like, the cybersecurity is, we've hit puberty and everybody wants to take us to the dance now. And and part of that is the cybersecurity function within an organization it has, a foot in a lot of different organizational silos. So there's stuff that has to do with legal and compliance. There's we're talking about risk. Sometimes you have a risk department that's all onto itself. You definitely have, people ops or HR. You're going to have the IT kind of the internal IT support group. You're going to have product engineering. You're going to have DevOps or SREs, and even marketing. So there are controls. For instance, we'll pick on HR because I think that's like the question. There are security controls that are HR controls. And my approach, and so I'm biased in this, but I really feel that HR should own those things. HR should own training and the LMS, and the HRIS. Security can go to HR and partner with them and say, hey, we need security awareness training, for whatever reason, best practice, compliance, etc. So, we'd like to have that as part of our LMS. Here are some options. This is our recommendations, but the decision should be with HR, in my opinion. So it's very much like security should come in and be very advisory in that capacity. Similar with legal. That's actually, not to get too far into the topic, but I have another strong opinion that you have to, when you're dealing with security incidences, the worst, the least fun part of cybersecurity, you need to define who gets to say the B word, who gets to call an incident a breach. And typically that, my opinion is that should be legal. That should be legal counsel. They get to say the B word. And so it's one of those things where, security is going to do that incident investigation and triage and quarantine, but then they will advise and recommend and lay out the picture and the story to legal, who ultimately makes that determination. And it should be, and ideally, security should not care what legal decides if an incident is a breach or not. All they should care about if they did their job to the best of their ability. So does that answer the question?
Mr. Brent? Hey.
Yeah, I guess indirectly. I mean, here's where my question is, right? So, I'm running a small company, and I have a big client who wants to say, we want you to be SOC compliant, right? So we go through all the hoops, right? But there are certain things like saying, hey, you have to have an annual performance review for each one of your employees. You have to have it documented. And my question for me is like, my philosophy on performance reviews is if there's a problem, we take care of it. We don't wait for this stupid annual review and goal setting and frankly, all this HR BS. And I get when you got 1,000 people in the company, it's a little different, right? But so I have a very strong aversion to letting compliance drive how I run my business.
I would agree with
that specific question.
I agree and I support that. I think when it comes to cybersecurity, like compliance is an after effect of good security. You shouldn't be doing these things to check a box. In fact, lots of people get in trouble by doing that. HIPAA's famous for people shooting themselves in the foot for just box checking, because you may be HIPAA compliant one day, but HIPAA has holes in it. It is not a framework. It's nowhere near complete. A lot of compliance requirements are not complete. fact, I would argue only ISO 27001 is. So yes, I'm with you. I support you 100%. And it's kind of one of the ways where it's like, okay, in the spirit of performance reviews, you are doing what you feel is best. You are getting the value out of that the way you feel you should. Great. How do you then apply that and check that box to your customer? I mean, are they really asking for copies of your performance reviews? That seems very big brothery. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I've seen stranger things, but or are they just going to say, "Hey, did you do performance reviews?" And you're like, "Yeah, I did performance reviews." And if that's the extent of the dialogue, then great. And did the classic
I would just ask, even just from the more fundamental perspective, what do performance reviews have to do with security, right? I mean, there's, I got a firewall, right? I got routers. I have, my internally, like my pipes are from one server to another, right? So one server can't talk to, so there's all these different things, and I'm just really have a hard time connecting a performance review. And granted, if you have somebody who's unhappy, right, are they going to get a bad performance review? They might not, right? They'll just sell, if someone offers $1 million, frankly, they're going to sell you out anyway, regardless of whether, and I'm not saying anybody would, I'm just saying, it's like if somebody offers you enough money, it doesn't matter where you fall on that spectrum. How's a performance review going to impact our ability to secure our infrastructure and data?
Yeah, usually what I've seen, and to my recollection, I don't think I've ever seen a request around performance reviews within the context of cybersecurity. Usually it's, hey, are you doing background checks and screening people? Are you training them? Are you having them sign confidentiality agreements and annual acknowledgments of those confidentiality agreements? And a lot of that's, wrapped into the acceptable use policy, which is a very HR-centric thing. And if you're in a lot of those things, is kind of like, yep, no, this is a bit of the annual kind of housekeeping. No one likes to do this, but yeah, it's like, let's read the policy or the policies. Let's sign the thing that says we acknowledge it. That way, if you do have a termination, and especially if it's contentious, but all of them, you should remind people that, hey, your commitment to confidentiality extends beyond your employment, right? So don't be taking our trade secrets and using them, essentially, or selling them. So yeah, but again, performance reviews is a little strange. I mean, I feel strongly about performance reviews. I think they have, as long as they're providing benefit and value, do them. But but you've got a ad hoc performance review, methodology. I'm not an HR. I'm not a super HR professional. I mean, I've got friends who are, and and they may have very defined opinions around this, but I'm very much like, if your ad hoc process is getting you what you need, great. I also don't really see how that necessarily plays into security per se. I mean, maybe you could do a stretch around, like, hey, you've got your DevOps folks and you want them to make sure that they're expanding their horizons and going to seminars and stuff and getting extra training. Maybe I'm trying to kind of play the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But
okay. Well, I think that answers the question. I mean, basically, what I hear you say is, yeah, okay, maybe it's you're not supposed to like to check the box, but checking the box is a thing, and just and maybe if you have time at the end, you could talk a little bit about, because I don't want to derail the whole thing, but how do you politely go about telling a client, yeah, these things are important and these things aren't, and except for this thing, we're compliant, or we're not going to do this thing. And if that's a deal breaker, then, it is. So anyway, I'll let you keep on going, and we can come back to that later if you have time.
Yeah, no, happy to. Okay, so we talked about talking about risk. So I'll try to kind of speed run the risk assessment process. So once you've got like your methodology and your ouch point, you then want, and actually went through this. We've been going actually through this with a client last few weeks, who, well, I can't name names. Maybe, and actually, it's probably too much information. So they're going to do some. There's some cool stuff on the horizon. I'll say that much. But doing a risk assessment. So what you first do is you create what's usually called a threat registry. It's just a list of threats, things that go bump in the night. And at a very basic level, there's you can get more in depth, and but all risk assessments, there's inherent error. It's not, none of them can be perfect. So you pick one that's kind of that best fit. But what you're doing is you're looking at those threats. Threat, again, we'll pick on phishing, right? And you're looking at what is the likelihood, what is the probability that this threat could actualize in any capacity, and giving that a value. And then you're looking at impact, and the impact is independent of that likelihood. So with you disregarding probability, what is the worst case scenario, and how much would that impact the company? So you have values for those, you multiply them together, and you get a risk value. It's probably easier to kind of just demonstrate that with which is actually the harder of the risk assessment methodology, the quantitative one. But if you've got, we'll say phishing is $1 million impact. So like the worst case scenario, it would cause $1 million loss, total loss to a company. And let's say that you experience phishing attempts 100 times a year. Your risk is $100 million. Because it's 100 times a year. So you should be budgeting, $100 million for phishing. Well, that seems kind of crazy. But kind of the next, and then you get into like, okay, what controls that I have, and how do they mitigate that? And how do they reduce that risk? So like, okay, we're getting 100 attempts, but most of them are getting stopped by M365 or Gmail or whatever. And we've got other things. And so that really comes down to, we may actually get like a legitimate phishing attempt once every 10 years. I'm just using simple math. So now that $1 million budget per year, $100,000. Yeah, I'm oversimplifying, but that's generally how these things work. And then you look at that risk, and you look at your risk tolerance, and is this above or below your ouch point? And you say, if it's below, great. For the most part, let's roll the dice and move on. If it's above, what else could you do to further lower that risk? So that's how you're assessing risk. So there's this kind of spectrum that you're gauging. Assessing your controls is much more simple. It's very binary. It's I'm going to switch to a different control, vulnerability scanning. Right? If your control is that you're going to run automated vulnerability scans once a month, that's it. Are you doing it? Yes or no? Binary. Add up the scores, compare those, find opportunities for improvement. That's what these two things are really about. Finding those opportunities to improvement, and and really reduce risk and reduce hopefully impact to the bottom line. Okay, so rights, that was kind of talk a little about rights. I want to talk about right timing. So there needs to be, I kind of talked about the two ends of the spectrum, gave some examples. You really need to have a strategic roadmap. So you take those things like risk assessments and the results and the control assessments, and you put them on a roadmap. And maybe some of these things are a 5-year initiative. Maybe these are things you can knock out real quick. But just basic project planning. That roadmap, it could be a Kanban, it could be a Gantt chart, it could be something else, doesn't matter. But have a plan, have a plan, and phase it out, and pick those milestones along the way. There's another set of controls I'm a big fan of. Some of you may have heard of the SANS Top 20. They're not called that anymore. They're actually called the critical security controls. But it's a grouping of now 18 controls that give you the most bang for your buck. That's how they're ranked. That's what they're there for. But implementing them is, you don't just, snap your fingers and do it. You need to leverage into it. And it's a 3 to 5 year endeavor, maybe more. But they're very powerful. So it's very key to have those milestones and those markers along your journey. All right. Now I'm going to get to what I think is kind of the fun stuff. This is kind of like where an organization may be and what are the sorts of things that you should be thinking about. So again, the seed stage, MVP, getting that MVP going, minimal controls, maximum growth. I'm not going to say, oh, you need to be perfect in every single way and do all of these security things right out of the gate. No, if you're doing your accounting on the back of a napkin, then you should not be paying for a SIM like, Splunk. Like, no, don't do that. That's silly. But you do a little, lay out a foundation, have, again, roadmap, like, oh, we're going to be US based and we're going to do the NIST controls. But as a minimum, have like, okay, what are the things that we need to do? And this is, really, especially with, your technical team, they will help with that. Your SREs and your prod eng, they're going to have a lot of good input on this. You don't necessarily need a cybersecurity nerd like me to say, hey, we need to have good password management. Like, it's not hard. That's been solved. I will say, though, especially at this stage, but all the stages, 2-factor authentication, whether it's Duo or Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, whatever, use that. That has saved more people's bacon in the last 10 plus years than I can count. I have so many stories where, one was, there was a VP co-founder, and he was having a glass of wine by the fire with his wife, and then he gets a little notification on his phone. It's like, hey, you're trying to log into prod. He's like, looks across the room, and there's his laptop in his bag. He's like, no, I'm not. 2FA saved him, because his password was the same password he'd used in college. So that was, he reused the password, but 2FA saved them. I do want to call out something specific to the Microsoft crowd. I don't know if we're necessarily, all in that bucket or not, but CISA, the government agency, has published on GitHub, and you just Google search this, secure baseline configurations for Microsoft 365. It's called Scuba Gear. So if you just Google CISA Scuba Gear, it's all right there. You don't have to think about it. Conversely, if you're in Google, there's also Scuba Goggles. It's the same deal. It's on GitHub. It's there. Like, brilliant people, teams of brilliant people put these together, and it's free for everybody. So that's
I've never heard of this. This is amazing.
Yeah, no, this is really cool stuff.
So these are just like automated scripts you can run to do what a lot of other security companies make you pay for?
No, these are how to harden those environments. So to oversimplify security hardening, the classic example is, don't use default passwords, right? I think we've all, probably installed a Wi-Fi router at one point in our life, and it's, the credentials are admin password. You want to change those. And please, if anyone is running admin password on their Wi-Fi's, I highly recommend logging into routerlogin.net and changing them.
I gotta go do that.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
So there's a lot of techniques. There's a lot of different things, and this is basically configuration management stuff. But it's taking those default settings, like when you get M365 basically out of the box, it's in the default setting. It's kind of flapping in the wind. So you then apply these configurations, and now it is hardened very reasonably. And it's a cheat sheet. These are cliff notes on how to do it. You don't have to go and research a lot of other stuff. In addition to, we're talking about this, and this maybe at the seed stage, maybe at the next stage, but might be skipping ahead to my next slide. But additional hardening guidelines are for operating systems. They're available for free. The Center for Internet Security, who is responsible for those critical security controls I mentioned before, they publish what they call them benchmarks, and each benchmark for various, and we're talking cloud, server, workstation, mobile device, etc. All these operating systems, they have hardening guides, and it's literally, a PDF that is every single thing you could do to lock that system down. So it's not necessarily as what I'll call optimized as scuba gear and scuba goggles, but it's an exhaustive list of, hey, if I'm running this kind of Linux server, these are the things I could do to make it more secure. I'm not saying you have to do all of them. I'm not recommending that, but it's kind of a list of the things you could do. But the scuba gear, hey, you're starting out, got an M3, you got a starter M365 account, go to GitHub, do this, boom. Now that environment is more secure. Now you are more protected. All right, I want to get into the kind of the next. So we talked about kind of the baby stage of a company. This is the fun. This is where stuff starts getting real fun. This growth stage. This is about, you've proven you have something, and now you've got to prove that you can scale, right? And you get that Series A, and you get Series B, and I'm sure you've all heard about the hockey stick, the end of the hockey stick. That's the goal here. So now, taking that foundation we talked about before, the seed stage, and we're starting to mature it, right? We're going along that journey. But where the fun stuff happens is, instead of just being focused on, hey, let's secure our stuff because it's the right thing to do and we don't want to be exposed to risk, now we get to do stuff that is actually a catalyst to business growth. So this is the SOC 2. This is the ISO 27001 cert, or the CMMC cert for those in the defense sector. PCI if you're doing financial PCI transactions. There's all sorts of, again, alphabet soup, lots of them. But so this is where this is kind of a make or break. So and I do see people go a little hog wild here, kind of like that one client I said about all the PCI stuff. More realistically though is, you may have a customer that comes to you and they say, we like what you do, we like your service, we want you to have a SOC 2 before we do business, before we continue doing business with you. Like, okay, that is potentially good news, potentially scary news, maybe a bit of both. Potential pitfall here is, how much is that deal worth to you? Because example is, I once had they never were a client, but they're a prospect, come to me and say, hey, situation, I've got someone, they want, customer, they want me to get a SOC 2. Like, okay, how much revenue do you get from them? Well, I get $250K a year. It's like, okay. Do you have any other clients asking for this? Nope. Like, okay. If you do a SOC 2, if you get a SOC 2 on the cheap, like with not my help, on the cheap, dirty, I mean, you're checking boxes and that's it, and even then barely, you're still looking at 25 grand a year. So you're taking a 10% hit on that revenue by doing this SOC 2. So the question is, can you provide other assurances and avoid going, the cost of, preparing for and going through these audits? Because, if you can provide those assurances and not have to do an audit, great. It's just that one customer. Or maybe in some cases you can get that customer to pay for, or at least in part, your SOC 2. Then there's some gamification. But then on the flip side, if it's like 7-figure deal, or you've got a bevy of customers saying, hey, we want you to have a SOC 2. Now it's like, okay, this is going to be money well spent. We're going to get value out of this. And again, so you go through the process, and it's really more in the scale of $30,000 to $60,000 for a proper SOC 2. And it's not as much year over year, but the initial one is kind of in that range. But now you have that is a catalyst. So the more that you are growing and doing business and acquiring customers, they're going to say, hey, we need to do our due diligence. Do you have anything like a SOC 2? And you're like, here you go. Just sign the NDA. Here you go. And again, most of the time, they do like I said not to do, and they don't really read it. And they just say, hey, this is great. Let's do business. Sign on the dotted line. And you're off and running. You're off for the races. The other thing still is managing risk. Like I really like to look through the lens of risk management when it comes to security. It's like, again, really going back to my example of don't have the cost of the cure be more than the cost of the illness, so to speak. If that's a good enough analogy. All right. Now, once you get beyond, right, you've got multiple rounds of funding, or you've got an exit, or you're going public, you want to be optimizing your controls and managing risk. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but this is about building growth and stability. And if you're in that, that VC environment, your investors they're going to be driving this, because initially they're like, hey, we'll shell out, a couple $100,000 here, a couple $100,000 there. But now, one of these things is starting to take off, and it has that 100x potential. Now they want to manage risk. They see the trajectory, and they don't want it to slip. So it's that stability and risk management. And again, and all of the things I've talked about build on each other over time. It should be scaled. So and honestly, like, this is probably the most boring vanilla of the bunch. The first two are the fun ones, especially the hockey stick scaling ones. So a lot of talking, a lot of hand waving and gesturing. That's that's my take. This is my opinions and but also what I've seen over the years as far as security, and how, again, to time it and size it and scale it right, so that in one essence, you're not necessarily chaining yourself to your desk or shooting yourself in the foot, but also that you're laying that foundation, that path for growth. So I'll turn it over to Greg and questions.
Learned a lot. So before we get to questions, let's thank Sean for his time. Let's come off mute, throw on your video if you can. Let's give you a round of applause. Thank you, Sean. Our best virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Some reactions too. That rocked.